Like I said, he's an antichrist because he's following a prompting supposedly from God. He's on a mission to ultimately destroy the faith of millions and millions of members by rewriting church history. I'm really passionate about this because it really, really upsets me that we can have something that's so wonderful and glorious, our past, the past of our church, be tarnished like that. Individuals and their fallibility are perfectly capable of causing people to struggle in their faith. We don't need to fabricate and make up things to make it harder on individuals. And in fact, it's better if we can look at our history with a true lens of faith, because it is extremely faith promoting and exciting. So welcome to the Kings and I podcast. So as you can imagine, it's really hard for us to get together because we're states apart and we have families, responsibilities, and the summer's here. But I've been wanting a long time to start a book reading part of this channel where I share faith promoting, empowering books that I think you should learn about. But I do have to say, as we're doing this podcast, I'm hoping that the quality of what we're doing gets better and better as we go along, as we have time to improve what we're doing. As you can tell by my background, I really only have one really good place to record this if I'm not traveling, and that is in my office, which is in a storage room. So if you see all the stuff behind me, it's what I have to deal with. At some point, I'm going to eventually have a good office, but hope you can excuse that and focus on the content of this podcast, because that's what matters more. I want Latter-day Saints to be able to defend their own testimonies against this wokeness and discern truth. So anyways, I want to do a bit of a book review with you. I feel like there are some book review things happen out there, and they're pretty meh on YouTube and the LDS community. I feel like they're, aside from some of the interviews are pretty good, but I would love to share the approach or some of the thought-provoking things that come to me as I have read, and I think they'll be helpful to you. So let me ask this question. What do you do when it seems like history and science and even people in authoritative places, positions in the church or within the church's business organizations, when it seems like they are all saying the same thing, which is that the church is really kind of a ugly, messy, not so great thing. That church history is kind of embarrassing and you don't want to look at it. That perhaps the church is not as true as you want it to be. That perhaps it's not true. And that in order for us to maintain this belief in God calling certain individuals as prophet, and that things like the Book of Mormon and their miraculous come-abouts, and the miraculous come-about of the Book of Mormon, and that it is really from God. Maybe it's less from God, or maybe it's less spiritually exciting than we might think it to be. Maybe it's just a really hard pill to swallow. Now, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of things that are hard pills to swallow in the church and about church history and just in life in general. But sometimes we make things that are not hard pills to swallow hard to swallow. Or we allow ourselves to believe things that are not true because of individuals who write things that are said, things that are just kind of taken for granted or accepted as generally true, which are totally false. That cause us to be less than enthusiastic about the gospel and about Christ's restored church. If you are listening and participating in thoughts and in discussion and movements within our church that cause you to lose your enthusiasm and love for Christ's gospel and the leaders whom Christ has called, then I'm going to say that you need to take a step back and take a look at what's actually true. It would be very important, absolutely, for you to square up your testimony and make sure that is strong. But I would definitely say take a step back away from the sources that tarnish the beauty of Christ's restored church and the calling, the sacred calling that is given to Christ's apostles and prophets, and those men who have held it. I would say avoid those sources for a time, and trust the Lord that things are more glorious and more wonderful than you might imagine, despite genuine, real mistakes. And you should read some books, some good books. The book I want to talk about today is called Faith Crisis. Hopefully I can put this up on the screen so it's easier to read because my camera blurs it out, but it's called Faith Crisis. Volume 1, We Were Not Betrayed. A friend of mine in the branch where I'm at, he gave this to me to read. I became very interested in it because of some interviews that I saw. It's by two authors here, they're family members. One of the authors, Hannah Stoddard, she did some awesome interviews on some on like Word Radio and other places, and I was just like, wow, this is incredible. I want to read those books. I've read 2 of them so far. This is just one review of one of her books, and I think you got to hear about it, because if you've felt like maybe the church is kind of ugly, like it's past, and the reason why we should avoid thinking and believing those things is because it often lends credence. It allows us to support either actively or by omission a transformation within the church that is actually destroying people's testimonies and that are negative. And I speak specifically about people who are like, yeah, rough stone rolling, or second class Latter-day Saints, or whatever that book is. Like those sort of books, they don't present facts honestly, and their only actual goal in the end is to cause you to distance yourself from Christ and his church. I've never seen it turn out good for the individual who ends up believing and following these things. And those who hold on somehow for years with this sort of struggle and by consuming sources that make them this on-edge Latter-day Saint, I've never seen it turn out well for them. Either they leave entirely or they stick around, but they're just, they cannot build up God's kingdom in the way that, in the capacity that they could, because they are tripping over themselves, over these questions they have about history, when maybe there's a lot more truth that is glorious and faith promoting than they know. So enough of me pontificating. Faith Crisis. That's what I want to talk about. Faith Crisis, Volume 1, We Were Not Betrayed. Really, really great book. Let me just kind of give a background. For those of you who don't know, there was a man who was temporarily the church historian for the time. His name was Leonard Arrington, and to put it simply, he was an antichrist. He had this. He didn't serve a mission because he didn't want to. He'd rather go to college. He didn't really read the scriptures except for once when he was a kid. And I'm saying these things because his attitude towards those things, going and serving a mission, which is what the Lord has asked priesthood holders to do, reading the scriptures, he found those things basically as kind of like silly, ridiculous things that only, the starched, collared Latter-day Saints, those who iron out their shirts and are excited about going to church and participating in Sunday school, he finds those things to be silly. That he's rather a Latter-day Saint in kind of like what I've known a lot of Catholics to be. To them, Catholic is kind of like an ethnicity. Your family is Catholic, you're born Catholic, and it doesn't matter if you were baptized in it or not, doesn't matter if you believe in it or not, that's just your identity. That's kind of what he was. He was a social Latter-day Saint. But he did, and I say he's an antichrist because he had this thought, this feeling, which I can say very confidently came from the devil. But he thought it was from God, which a lot of antichrists think these messages come from God. That he had a great work to do in rewriting the church, the history of Christ's church. And so even though he really didn't believe in the Book of Mormon to be that true, the Joseph Smith to be a good prophet or anything like that, he was definitely on a mission. He was very dedicated to it, and he pulled off some pretty terrible things, the effects of which we are experiencing today. So he's following this mission to rewrite the history of the church. He believes it's what God has called him to do, despite him being an anti-Mormon in the church, right? Being anti-LDS. And he's very, very charismatic, very influential, and there's plenty of people who are intellectual like him. So his desire and along with the desires of other people who followed after him, other historians, intellectuals in the church, who want the things they write to be more accepted by people outside the church in the world. See, because church history has been written, like people write it, at least in the past, used to write it, and they used to try to follow sources that were bona fide, that were accurate and true, not from people who made up detracting statements because they did not like the prophet Joseph Smith or some other individual. Because a lot of times those statements are coming years later, they're random, they don't corroborate at all with literally hundreds of other sources of people who were daily and constantly with Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, other individuals like that. So when you start getting these anti-church sources, you just kind of ignore them. You look at them, you consider them, consider the context, and discover very, very, like pretty much always is the case, they are falsified, they're made up, and they're only meant to slander someone. They're not bona fide history. They wanted to do what Leonard Arrington wanted to do, was to take those sources and make them considered genuine, and also to water down the spirituality of church history, even when the sources, the only ones that exist, are from active faithful Latter-day Saints, like when they went to the Salt Lake Valley. They want to water down the faith promoting the spirituality of those things, because they don't want the history of the church being something glorious and God-driven. Rather, it to be kind of like a narrative of these people who have a very interesting faith, kind of interesting, and here's what they did, and here's how they try to distill a concept of spirituality into it post-context, rather than it actually being the actual context. That, like, they knew right off the bat this miracle came from God, rather than it being like, oh, that's coincidence, and then later saying it's from God. And right now I'm specifically referring to the seagulls eating the crickets in the Salt Lake Valley and saving the crops of the pioneers there, which is brought up, I think, either in this book or in the other book, which I have here as well, volume 2. Anyway, so that's the context of Leonard Arrington. Unfortunately, he gets hired to be a church historian, and all the people working with him, like I said, he's very influential. He networks and connects with all these other Latter-day Saints, people, intellectuals who want, they prefer being the honors and praise of men. And they don't really don't like the peculiarness of Christ's true church and the history. They want to slander it. They want it to look bad. It's so bad that when they come out with a history at some point, let me jump into this book, because now you know this man, unfortunately, is in charge of the church history department. Others under him are, toe to toe with him about this sort of stuff. Eventually, he gets dismissed from the church department, and they sent him to Brigham Young University, which is a really big mistake. And he and other intellectuals there continue to destroy the history of the church and faith of many, many members, because they like to lend credibility to sources that are not credible, that make the church sound kind of very sketchy as opposed to glorious, because it is glorious. So knowing that, I wanted to jump in here real quick, because the 1980s would have been a really, really hard time to be a Latter-day Saint, especially if you were an adult, right? Like, you're not some primary kid who doesn't hear about things going on in the world. Let's say you're an adult. It's kind of like today when people go, oh no, I saw this thing online about, is this true about church history, about this thing? Well, in the 1980s, I think starting at 1980, it was about 1980 to 1984, like a 4-year window. You had a lot of things coming out against the church to make it sound like it was not true and not Christ's church. Like, there's a big cover-up, as though the church has always been trying to cover up its own history. And that's really what Leonard Arrington and the Arringtonites wanted. Well, this guy named Hoffman, I'm trying to remember his first name. Anyways, Mark Hoffman, I think. He was some dude in Utah he was a Latter-day Saint, always studied anti-LDS things. This guy was insane. He's just crazy evil. And he somehow, right, he suddenly had all of these documents, like supposedly was coming across all these historical documents no one had ever found before, from people from the early days of the church, like a letter from Martin Harris about the salamander, or a written down, basically a patriarchal blessing, a blessing given from Joseph Smith Jr., so the prophet, to his son, Joseph Smith III, saying that he would become the prophet next, all this other stuff. And there was a lot of these documents, and he would sell them to all sorts of organizations, the church, the LDS church that we organized, and other people who wanted, like, oh, wow, this is incredible. And they'd spend tens of thousands of dollars to get these things. And somehow he has these things. And even when they put it to the test, they take him to people in the church and outside the church who are supposedly historical experts about verifying documents. They are all saying that these documents are truly authentic. They came from this old day, from that time period. Definitely authentic. Definitely the same individual. And so you get a lot of people who are going, gosh, like, are these crazy things that actually make the first vision some wild story instead of it being actually Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ visiting Joseph Smith? Is Joseph Smith having like a drug-induced episode? Or is the church not really supposed to have continued? Brigham Young stole it away from where it was actually supposed to go. There's a lot of these things coming out. And you have this guy Hoffman, he suddenly has all of them, and yet all of the science out there and all the intellectuals out there, all the science out there, all the intellectuals out there, they are all verifying that these things are true, right? So let me just back up real fast. It does not matter how much the world and how much evidence in the world points to your faith being wrong. Hold out. Hold on your way. Trust in your testimony, because eventually the truth will be uncovered, whether in this life or the next. But you should not trust. You don't need to trust in those sort of sources. In my own experience, when science is proving my faith wrong, whether it's in the Bible or the Book of Mormon, I know that eventually that science will change, and that's going to prove its own original confirmation of the falsity of the Bible. Eventually, that's going to prove itself wrong and false, and vindicate the truthfulness of things like the Bible, of the prophets. Well, Hoffman has all these documents. Then you randomly have these bombs go off and kill a couple people who had purchased documents from Hoffman, and Hoffman himself gets blown up in a bomb. And they're trying to figure out what's going on. While this is happening, and even before the bombs went off, while these documents are coming out, all these progressive professors or intellectuals, church historians, the ones who want to see the church history reshaped and changed because they don't like it, they don't like how spiritual and true it is, they are just loving it. There's all these letters back and forth between them saying this is like the best thing ever. It's like the best gift from God to us to show just how the prophet really wasn't that great of a guy, or they're like the church really isn't that wonderful. They love it. Well, when the bombs go off and it's starting to look like Hoffman was the one who bombed these individuals and that he accidentally blew himself up with the third bomb he was going to deliver to kill someone else, they are adamant that and they're holding out this hope that he's going to be proven that his documents everyone already knows his documents are true. But eventually they're also going to prove that he's not someone trying to kill anyone. Well, you have this investigator come, and his name is Throckmorton. That's his last name. George Throckmorton. You have to forgive me as I read a little bit here, but he says, determined to get to the root of this mystery. Like, is Hoffman really the one who did this? Are these documents actually, it looks like he did bomb them, but are these documents actually true? Like, are they really authentic? Because suddenly this guy has them, and how is he the one finding these all the time? George Throckmorton, a forensic document examiner, professor, and member of numerous police departments, began investigating Hoffman's documents, especially the salamander letter, Throckmorton was amused by the repeated announcements that Hoffman's documents had been proven genuine. According to the LA Times, Throckmorton knew there was no such thing as proof of a document's authenticity. One could, however, prove a forgery. That's just interesting. So he's going around, he wants to look at the documents, the original documents himself. Right? He said Throckmorton quickly realized that there were underlying assumptions and conflicting agendas at work which blinded some of the players. So he went to church historian Dean C. Jesse. Dean C. Jesse is like, he won't let him. So Dean C. Jesse, Leonard Arrington, these guys are all at BYU now, and they have access. They're the ones who have access to these documents. And he tries going to them to examine them, but they really want Hoffman to be right. So it says, the investigation's progress hit a bump in the road when Mark Hoffman agreed to submit to a renowned polygraph test and pass with flying colors. So meaning they did a lie detector test and he passed. Once again, more verifiable evidence that Hoffman was, his documents are true. He's not a murderer. He's not some crazy guy not trying to tear down the church, right? All the evidence continues to build, even while Throckmorton is trying to investigate this, continues to build that there is no case here, and that these progressives are vindicated. And then it says, Throckmorton needed to test the original documents. When he approached Dean C. Jesse, for access to the originals, he found himself stonewalled by the progressive historians at BYU, and the investigation came to a halt, despite their claims of objectivity and open-mindedness. Isn't that the truth? Objectivity and open-mindedness, that's what all these intellectuals say, but they are willing to poo-poo and ignore truly authentic things and jump to anything that will prove their conclusions correct. Throckmorton approached Dean C. Jesse to obtain the original documents Hoffman had sold to the church so they could be tested. Jesse shook his head. The investigation was unpopular among historians. Quote, Leonard won't let you have them, end quote, he guessed. Throckmorton telephoned Leonard Arrington, now head of the Church History Institute at BYU. He knew Arrington had been widely quoted in the press stating that at least 5 of the Mormon documents Hoffman had discovered were definitely authentic. Now Throckmorton introduced himself and told Arrington he needed photographs of the Hoffman documents. Arrington said he could offer no help except to suggest that Throckmorton pursue some other line of inquiry. You're on the wrong track, he advised, as they ended the conversation. So, it's ridiculous. Throckmorton is trying to even just get photographs of the original documents that were supposedly authentic from Hoffman, because you got to find out, what's true. If this guy's documents are actually true. Also, it's looking like he's a murderer. And you have to know, these documents make the church look really, really bad. But that's what Leonard Arrington and these other guys love. They love it. And like I said, he's an antichrist because he's following a prompting supposedly from God. He's on a mission to ultimately destroy the faith of millions and millions of members by rewriting church history. Bypassing the new Mormon history scholars and going straight to church leadership, Throckmorton was finally able to gain access to the original documents. In mid-December by 1985, he and fellow investigator William Flynn began their analysis. Flynn was an old friend and a document examiner for the state of Arizona. What's your religion? Throckmorton asked. Flynn said that he was a non-practicing Catholic. Perfect, thought Throckmorton. A Catholic who doesn't even go to church. Because he didn't want any conflict of interest there, as you can imagine. So they go through these things, and they had to get the church leadership to give them access to it, right? This is insane. They literally have to go into the vault to look at these documents that came from Hoffman and examine them. Ultimately, it is proven that his documents are forgeries. They're fake. It's incredible. You come across these things, and it turns out they're not true. He proves that he's able to discover, Throckmorton does, that all of the documents that came from Hoffman have a very distinct and have the same sort of pattern to them. That if you could line up any Hoffman documents with other church history documents by supposedly the same individuals who wrote those ones, You can tell which ones are Hoffmans. Very easy to tell. So it goes back to like, oh, but you had historians and experts around verifying historical documents inside and outside the church saying, we've examined them. They're true. It's real. So don't put a lot of stock in those things if it tears down your faith. Just saying. This book is so good. And I really want to interview the author, but only after I get a better background. All right, so let me go to another spot I think would be just really great, because Hannah Stoddard, and I think it was her father her belated father, they wrote this together, and they talk about how there's a conflict in the church. And as you can imagine, if you're in the 1980s and this comes across, imagine how relieving it would be if you were really concerned by all this stuff that's supposedly proven things to be sketchy and weird and untrue about the church. Supposedly, like imagine how relieving it would be to discover that was all just BS. But now, today, consider how perplexed we ought to be that there are still church historians trained after Hoffman and also in Hoffman's light to be progressive and to change things and to give credibility to uncredible sources. And those who don't truly love the church and believe it's true and believe in the greatness and heavenliness of the prophetic things done by the prophets. How perplexed it ought you to be to know that these same individuals are still writing church history, still working at the church and doing these things. Some of them still are, and at BYU. How perplexing is it, or should you feel, that those documents that are not credible, that are anti-Mormon, and also some of Hoffman's documents may still be out there and being used as evidence. Some of his might be, as far as we can tell, because he gave a lot of them were created, not just a couple, and we can't quite pinpoint all of them. But also the fact that you have these sources that are not credible still being used as credible sources. Rough Stone Rolling being a really, really great example of someone who did that, and also someone who took good sources and twisted the words of them. Sorry, I'm really passionate about this because it really, really upsets me that we can have something that's so wonderful and glorious, our past, the past of our church, be tarnished like that. Individuals and their fallibility are perfectly capable of causing people to struggle in their faith. We don't need to fabricate and make up things to make it harder on individuals. And in fact, it's better if we can look at our history with a true lens of faith, because it is extremely faith promoting and exciting. So moving on, Hannah mentions, she talks about the dominant narrative test. Is the dominant narrative true? This is page 91. Basically, she comes down to, okay, well, there's kind of two different types of people when it comes to church history. There are the traditionalists and there are the progressives. Now listen to this. Is the dominant narrative true? To answer this question, we must first define what it is that represents the dominant narrative. For nearly 2 centuries, the church maintained a consistent message about its foundational events, that God directed Joseph Smith as his prophet to restore the church, and to organize the church according to the pattern of his primitive church. Furthermore, that account characterizes the prophet Joseph Smith as a righteous man who built the church based on literal revelations received directly from God, and that actual angels appeared, and the members witnessed the manifestations of authentic miracles. Additionally, God restored his priesthood through Joseph Smith, the restorer and head of this dispensation, who stands next to the Son of God in righteousness and holiness as a pure and holy vessel. She says, traditionalists believe the points of the foregoing represent the essence, the dominant narrative of the restoration event. Think about it. Did Joseph Smith, was he really a prophet of God? And if so, did all those revelations he received that we call the Doctrine and Covenants, are they true? Or are they, as a lot of these progressive church intellectuals and especially those who will like to get on Fair Mormon. I really don't like that channel. They're like apologetic, like almost like afraid to defend the church. So they have to do it in a way where you're just like, that's not very faith promoting, not very well done either. And maybe that's on purpose, or maybe it's because their lack of faith and their desire for things not to be as truthfully amazing and miraculous. They don't want that to be true. She says, progressives disagree adamantly, arguing that the dominant narrative of the church is not true and believing that an immense cover-up has occurred. If sources of things, the people you speak to and the things that you consume in media and books cause you to believe that there is a giant cover-up in the church, then you need to avoid it because it's not true. It's purposely built to destroy your faith. Progressives in the church, that the dominant narrative is not true, believing that an immense cover-up has occurred, that when acknowledged will allow a full-scale reconstruction of the story. The angel Moroni told Joseph Smith that his name would be had for good and evil, so perhaps it is fitting that the struggle continues both on the world stage and in the homes of members of the church. So we are imperfect, and we have we make lots of mistakes. But is the dominant narrative true? From what I have studied and what I've seen, it is. Going back to what I was trying to say earlier about the people like on Fair Mormon and all those intellectuals, I really don't like them. And I'm trying not to say more derogatory things because it's very upsetting to me. But do we take the revelations from Joseph Smith to be actual revelations directly from God? Or we take them to be inspirational-ish that is greatly mixed with the cultural and social limitations and thinking of Joseph Smith's day? Because I've seen that sort of angle presented by these intellectuals, which, if that is the case, how can you put any stock and believe in the truthfulness of them? Instead, what you'll do is you'll read them, and then you'll pick them apart and say, well, I feel like this part is probably true, but I feel like this part is probably fabricated or manipulated because it fits their time period. No. Joseph Smith said that there are no errors in the revelations. They came from Christ, and he said they are true. So either that's true or it's not. Either it's all pure revelation from the Lord Jesus Christ to his prophet, just like in days anciently, or it is not. Thank you so much for listening. We have a lot to battle in this church. We need to put asunder the wokeness that is destroying people's testimonies. And when your testimony is destroyed, it does destroy your life in a terrible, terrible way. Because you then abandon the greatness of the blessings of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. That's terrible. Those blessings are incredible, and they are eternal and everlasting. This book, I can put it here, Faith Crisis. Gosh, I'll have to put an edit there. But Faith Crisis, Volume 1, We Were Not Betrayed, by Hannah Stoddard and James F. Stoddard III. Really, really great book. The second volume is really good too. I can't wait to review that with you. Let me know what you think. Is there really a church cover-up? And if so, what particular part of church history is there a cover-up on? Or what is less than glorious? What revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants do you say is fabricated? Or do you believe it to be true? I believe it to be 100% true from Jesus Christ. I'm not piecemealing it because I know it to be true by the Holy Ghost. What do you think? And when have you encountered, I'm curious to know, because we've all encountered this, when have you encountered times when people have said, like what are those things people have said or things you've experienced and seen which give you pause about the gloriousness and wonderfulness of the church? I'm not talking about a bishop being a total dirtbag. Or this one stake president said something that offended me. I mean, things that try to ultimately make the church fundamentally unlikable, less glorious, and untrue. That make you want to distance yourself or agree with your critics. Because I don't want to agree with my critics, especially because my critics they don't have the truth. And whether they're being purposely dishonest or not, they have not good sources. Anyways, thank you so much for listening. it really takes a lot of time and effort to make this sort of content, to read these books, and to record this. I've got 5 kids, right? And I know all of you who watch this, you've got your own families, you've got your own lives, and I know if you've taken the time to listen to this, it means a lot to me that you've listened to this. And please support the channel by liking, subscribing, commenting. That helps this to be found by other people. And please share this with someone else that you feel like could really benefit from hearing this. And you should definitely get this book. And if you know Hannah Stoddard, tell her I want to talk to her. Anyways, I'll talk to you all next time.